I talked to the boss, and Jessica Hollis will now be working in Randy's place. Don't you want to come home so I can show you how much you mean to me? No. I'm still pissed that this was all planned weeks ago, and you waited until now to take it out on me. And it's not just that you're leaving with a jerk. It's that we talked about you getting pregnant when we bought a nice house. She knew she had to keep lying. I told my boss I only agreed to a few trips, and he'd have to find a replacement for me. I want to have kids too. She figured once the trip started, she could convince him how important it was to her. I'll think about it. Now go away. But Mark, go away, go away, go away, go away, go away. She took a step closer, but he looked at her angrily. She sighed and turned away. Ted came out of the house a few minutes later. She lied. You know, she always said you have to say, first. You saw that too, didn't you? Mark sighed and sat back down. I'm sad to say it's over between us. I'm going to wait until she's gone to start taking action. Use my divorce lawyer. She's cute as a button but meaner than a bulldog. And in the courtroom, she gets right to the point. I don't want to hurt her like this. I had a chance to cut this thread before we got married. But I didn't. She was going to fail a subject I had to pass to get into engineering. But I backed down and let her get her way. Big mistake. He thought of the girl who had mentored him and reached into his laptop. Let's see. How could I forget that name? 10 minutes later, he found her on Facebook. Monday morning, he got a text from Millie. Millie, Mark, have you decided to come home? I'm leaving with Jessica on Friday and would like to spend at least one night with you in our bed before we leave. I'm giving you everything you want. So what's the problem? He read her message and called her office. Hanger and Son. Can I help you? Yes, put me through to Jessica Hollis, please. I'm a relative of hers from out of town and would like to speak with her. Sure, 1 minute. No, wait. She's not here anymore. She went on maternity leave a few days ago. That's wonderful. I'm sure she's looking forward to her first child. But she already has 2 children. Who did you say you were? He pressed the red button on his phone. On Wednesday, Millie reappeared unannounced on Ted's terrace. Why are you being so difficult about this, Mark? He leaned back in his chair and stared at her. Remember when we dated in college? You were mad at the tutor I picked. Yeah, so? I could tell she wanted to get into bed with you. I had a right to be angry. You didn't care one bit that my final exam grade would determine my future. Then you faked a hot kiss with a guy to make me jealous. Well, you hired the bitch anyway, so I was desperate. I still remember your ultimatum. Take it or leave it. So now it's my turn. If you continue with the audit, we're finished. Done. That's my job, and by golly, I'm going. I'll see you when I get back. She moved in to kiss him, but he pulled away. He hadn't heard from her on Friday, so he drove back to their house. Her big suitcase and pile of clothes were gone now. He had a week or two to move all her stuff out and separate their savings and checking accounts. After stopping their joint credit cards and Costco card, he changed the passwords on their online shopping accounts and took her out of her life insurance policy. I can't believe this just happened, Randy whispered, snuggling up to Millie. An angry image of her husband's face flashed through Millie's mind when he said they were done. Why don't we get on one of the tour buses and see Rome? Rome? Why would you want to see Rome when you have me naked in your bed? I'm sure sex will get me up and ready again. Randy, this is wrong. I made a big mistake, and we can never do this again. I love my husband, and I can't risk losing him. So when we get back, I'm quitting my job. Now go away. He was furious and called her several horrible names, one of which was asshole tease, and another was frigid bitch. They managed to get audited, but it took 2 weeks due to a lack of communication. In the meantime, she continued to call and leave messages for Mark about how she missed him and couldn't wait to hold him again. Every night, after not finding a return message from him, she cried herself to sleep. The airplane was tossing and turning because of the impending storm front. Many passengers were praying for a safe trip to the airport. Millie's knuckles turned white as she gripped the armrests of her seat. The plane skidded slightly sideways, but the engines kept it on the runway. When the plane landed safely and was at the gate, Randy didn't wait for her as she took her time lowering her bag. Since she didn't want Mark to see Randy get off the plane with her, she didn't ask him to pick her up. Taking a cab, she tried to open the front door, but the key wouldn't work. As she rang the doorbell, a strong wind blew and fluttered her hair. She heard someone open the door and was about to throw herself into Mark's arms when a beautiful woman with short red hair appeared. Behind her stood a smiling Jessica Hollis. "Scarlett, what are you doing? What are you doing here?" "Finished?" the green-eyed beauty asked. "You see, I live here now, and you, my dear, have disappeared with the wind. Where is my husband? I want to see him." "What are you doing here, Jessica? It seems you've been using my name in an attempt to hide your connection to Randy. I want everyone to know that I wasn't part of your cheating plan. And by the way, everyone in the office knows how you lied to your husband. Okay? Okay. But my name is also on the title of this house, so get the hell out." Mark stepped around Scarlett and Jessica and stood up, crossing his arms. "I told you it's over between us. You'll need a court order to come back here. I doubt you can get it by Monday, so get off this porch, you cheating bitch." "Mark, please, we need to talk. I'm going to resign on Monday, and then all of this will be behind us. We're done. Done. Have a nice life, Millie," he hummed, then walked back into the house and slammed the door behind him. "I wish it was over, but I know she's too stubborn to leave anyway. Thanks, Scarlett and Jessica, for stopping by to greet her. Please keep me posted on any developments regarding your little Jessica and Scarlett." "I hope we can." "Me too," she finished his sentence. "There is no good way to find out that your wife has had sex with another man, but trust me, some ways are worse than others. But surely, the way I found out has to be the worst way of all." This day was similar to many others that had preceded it, and the weather, as I recall, was nothing exceptional. What was abnormal was that when I got home in the evening, my wife of 6 years was not there. Robin worked part-time in an insurance office for some guy named Tom Blowers, had been there for 6 months or so, and was usually home by this time. I would go away on business for a few days and look forward to being welcomed back into the arms of my beautiful young wife. Her absence didn't particularly bother me, but unfortunately, my indifference was overridden. An hour passed, and I was beginning to worry when the front doorbell rang. I jumped up and headed for the door, wondering if Robin had lost her key. But when I opened the door, I was surprised to find 2 police officers standing there. "Mr. John Fielding?" one asked calmly. "That's me," I replied, wondering what they could possibly want. "Your wife is Robin Fielding?" "Quite right," I confirmed, my insides filling with lead as I imagined what bad news that question could mean. And so, it was much worse than I could have expected. "I'm sorry, sir, but we have some bad news for you." The rest was like a blur, and you'll pardon me if I don't, or rather, can't, repeat it word for word. The bad news, of course, was that my Robin, my beautiful young wife, was no longer with us. She was not at home with dinner ready on the table for the simple reason that some poor unfortunate soul had dragged her lifeless body out of the river. Nor was she there the next day or the day after that. In the next few days I cried a lot. I cried and cried to a God I had never believed in, demanding an explanation of how he could be so cruel. I opened her drawers and closets and spent hours looking at her clothes and underwear, unable to accept that I would never see any of it on my beloved wife again. People were nice, or tried to be, but how could they comfort the inconsolable? I hardly knew her parents, who lived overseas, but even so, calling them with the news was just awful. Could none of them bring my Robin back? Just when I thought I had reached the bottom of the pit, things got even worse. They had no idea how Robin could have ended up in the river on a perfectly ordinary spring day, or even why she was in that part of town. An autopsy was duly performed, and to my shock it was discovered that Robin had taken a whole bunch of pills, probably sleeping pills, shortly before she hit the water. The term suicide was in use, but it didn't apply to me directly at the time. The police came to me and asked, or maybe told me, that when I was ready they needed to talk to me at the station. I didn't want to do that, not wanting to admit that Robin might have done that or that she had any reason to do that. God, I had yet to accept that she wasn't going to walk through the door any minute with that seductive giggle I had so quickly fallen in love with. Shortly after I escorted the police officers out, I opened my laptop to grudgingly check my email for the first time since that horrible night. And that's when I found her. I found the item that sent my life even further down the slope. A single piece of paper. It had Robin's handwriting on it, which I knew so well. Blotches smeared across the words. Obviously, her tears had dripped onto the paper as she wrote them. My dear, beloved husband, by the time you read this, I will be gone. Forgive me, my love, for hurting you, but I just can't live anymore. I can't live with myself anymore because of what I've done to you and our marriage. 3 days ago, Tom asked me to stay in the office for 10 minutes after the others left to help him finish some paperwork, but that wasn't his real reason. I'm not sure you can call it rape, but he forced himself on me. I swear to you, John, I tried to resist, but he was much stronger than me, and soon I became exhausted and just gave up. He undressed me and started raping me. And God help me, John, I gave in to him. I only know this because afterward, he let me get dressed but wouldn't let me leave until he showed me the video he had taken and made it clear that within the hour, it would be edited to show the world how I had encouraged him and was a willing partner, unless, of course, I let him enjoy my body again. That night, I came home and burst into tears. I swear I would have confessed it to you, but you were gone for 4 days up north for a trade show, and by the time you returned, Tom had threatened to expose me to you, our friends, my parents, and the world. I couldn't think straight, and you weren't there to help me, so I gave in to his demands to have sex with him again, to shut him up. Of course, it was stupid of me, but by then, it was too late and he blackmailed me into continuing. I'm sorry, my love, but I can't take it anymore, and I have to put an end to it. I can't look at you when you come back, and I can't look at the world, and I pray that you forgive me for taking the easy way out. I hope you find the strength to forgive me for what I did, and I pray you forget about me and find another woman more worthy. Your loving wife, Robin. Words can be found to describe my feelings after reading this letter, but I cannot string them together. I should have gone to the police right away, but the thought never crossed my mind, and if it had, my story would have been very different. I sat there and remembered how we'd met. I had dropped out of school and joined the merchant navy rather than going to university and soon found myself on a supertanker in the middle of the ocean. Royal Dutch Shell didn't think it was worth spending too much time training its new officer cadets before they could prove they could adapt to life at sea. It's not worth spending money only to find out that I get seasick all the time or miss my mom too much. It was a case of throwing yourself into deep water and swimming or sinking. And out there, in the middle of the ocean, drowning didn't seem like an attractive option. Over the next few years, our anchorages and ports around the world were shorter than those in the Royal Navy, but our officers' uniforms seemed just as attractive to the local ladies, and the higher pay probably even more so. Not that I dated professional ladies, although the distinction between them and some of my bedmates was sometimes somewhat blurred. The first woman on my first shore leave might well have been an exception, though I'd been too drunk to know the difference. If so, I wasn't the one paying her, but it wasn't uncommon for shipmates to make sure new recruits didn't come home virgins. That was the end of my personal life until one day, the company decided I had a special skill they wanted to use ashore in their technical department. I started a new career direction, with the promise that I could transfer back to the ships if it didn't suit me. I decided that suited me just fine in my 3rd week back ashore, when I was introduced to Robin at a party. She was unlike any girl I'd met before, and I had almost no idea how to act around her. Up until that point, I had almost never dated a girl unless I ended up in bed with her on the first night, unless I got drunk out of my mind or got into a fight. But Robin was different from the other girls I had dated, and I swear she was the one who first hinted that maybe, after 4 weeks, we should move on with our relationship, as she put it. So we did, and a year later we bonded in marriage. Another 6 years passed, and the knot was suddenly and violently severed. As I wiped away my tears, I decided that someone had to pay, and only one person could pay for what Robin had taken from me. I should have gone to the police, but like I said, I didn't, and I ended up at the damn insurance agency, opening the door and barely remembering how I got there. Brushing aside the receptionist's questions, I stormed into Tom's office, bloody blowers, and came face to face with him. "You bastard!" I shouted at him. "Mr. Fielding." he replied, panting, jumping to his feet, and placing the desk between us. We're all very sorry about your wife. Sorry? I asked angrily. You bloody murdered her. Look, Mr. Fielding, I think. It doesn't matter what you think. I interrupted him. You blackmailed her. You bastard. Bullshit, he shouted back at me. I have proof. You can't prove anything. He grinned back, convinced that Robin's letter was true. If he had any doubts at all, then... Wait for the police to read this, I shouted at him, holding Robin's letter in front of his face for him to read. Stupid girl, he snapped, only managing to read the first few lines. And at that moment, something inside me shivered. Tom was bigger and heavier than me, but not by much. Unlike him, I had learned to fight in some of the roughest ports in the world, and he probably hadn't swung his fists in anger since he'd left school. I chased him around the table, Tom trying to keep it between us until he thought he had a chance to surprise me. The punch was so long I could have easily dodged it, but I didn't even bother. His punch landed, but before he could prepare another, I threw 4 or 5 punches at him, knocking him to the floor. Rushing to punish him even more, I angrily pushed the table to get to him, only just managing to flip him over onto his back. The bastard scrambled behind the table, trying to defend himself from the barrage of punches and kicks I unleashed on him. I screamed in frustration that I couldn't get to his face to sink my teeth into the back of his skull. Maybe it was the noise, maybe it was the fact that I had squeezed past the receptionist with anger, or maybe there was a patrol car nearby. But the next thing I knew, the guys in blue were dragging me away from the bloody mess underneath me, apparently hitting me with a taser as I turned on them in a rage as well. I woke up in prison, all sore, surprised at my own cruelty but not regretting it. I hoped I had killed him, whatever the consequences, and swore I would someday when I found out I hadn't. For the first time in my life, I learned what it meant to truly hate someone. It wasn't the most pleasant experience, but perhaps, in some strange way, it eased my pain of losing my wife. I suppose the brain only has a certain capacity for emotions, and the sadness that was so dominant in me had to make room for the hatred I felt at the time. Tom lay in the hospital, badly beaten, and I knew that I would probably have to pay for it. And with the evidence I had of his blackmail, he would suffer even more at the hands of the court. That thought allowed me to calm down a little, until another suddenly came upon me like a speeding train. My evidence. Where was it? When I'd rushed to go and punch him in the face, it hadn't occurred to me to make a copy of Robin's letter. And when the police dragged me out of Tom's office, what had become of it? Oh shit. I convinced myself that justice would prevail and the letter would be found. But it never was. In the state Tom was in, it was doubtful he could have gotten rid of it, and the receptionist's secretary denied seeing it when questioned by the police. I begged and tried, to the point of tears, to persuade the law officials to pursue the case, but alas, to no avail. It all came down to the fact that I had spoken against him, that the letter existed at all. And in the state I was in, my sanity must have been under suspicion. I am almost certain that the investigator believed my story in his heart, but without proof even I had to admit, in the end, that the matter was hushed up. But not in my case. I gave Tom a good beating, and when asked if he wanted to press charges, he agreed. Not satisfied that he was responsible for my wife's death, he now wanted revenge on me. Not only that, his lawyer opposed my release on bail pending trial, telling the court that his client feared for his safety if I was released. Of course, he was right, although it was his life rather than his safety that he should have been worried about. And when bail was denied, my hatred just went through the roof. The trial could have gone worse, all things considered, and I think I smiled for the first time in months when Tom limped out to testify, the marks I'd made on him still visible. Throughout the interrogation, he avoided looking at me, while my gaze in his direction never faltered. I wondered if that had an effect on some of the jurors. The prosecution bought into the fact that I boxed and presented it as if I were a professional or something, as if I was a dangerous person out of control. My lawyer said it was at a low level when I was in high school and was irrelevant. I figured if my boxing was a problem, they should have been concerned that I played soccer because I probably did more damage to him with kicks than fists, since he was hiding under his desk. Another moment that went in my favor was when my lawyer asked Tom if he thought I was justified in attacking him after he blackmailed my wife and drove her to suicide. "Objection!" shouted the prosecutor. The good judge, unfortunately quite correctly, allowed it, telling my lawyer to be careful what he said and instructing the jury to ignore the question. "All right," continued my lawyer, turning to face Tom. "Assuming my client thought you were blackmailing his wife, do you think he was—" "Objection, Your Honor." Rumble. It took a good 10 minutes to restore silence to the court, with another instruction to the jury to ignore what my attorney was saying and a rather harsh reprimand to him. The prosecutor asked for a recess, but the judge refused, gently hinting that he believed the blackmail charge, though he could not allow it to be heard in the courtroom. When it was my turn to testify, it started all over again when I was asked why I beat up my late wife's employer. And yes, my lawyer phrased it that way. It gave me the opportunity to speak out, but choosing my words carefully. After my wife committed suicide, I began hesitating and looking directly at the jury to make sure they understood. I found a letter from her explaining to me why she did it. The prosecutor jumped to his feet, but the judge overtook him, waving for him to sit down and warning me to be careful what I said. "And where is the letter now?" the judge asked. "I left it in Blower's office when I went to beat him up for what he did to my wife," I replied. The judge waved his hand at the representative on the other side, and he jumped to his feet again. "Mr. Fielding," he said to me sternly, "I have warned you to be careful what you say in my court. How can I answer a question honestly if I'm not allowed to talk about the fact that the bastard raped my wife and then blackmailed her and drove her to suicide?" I managed to get a word in before the court exploded again. There were shouts of objection and order in court. And this time, everyone seemed to jump to their feet. Even a few jurors stood up and shouted to add to the confusion. This time, my representative asked for a recess, and I think the judge was relieved to grant it, ordering the two attorneys to retire to their chambers immediately. I never learned what was discussed between the three of them, but before the case was resumed the same day, I was warned that although the charge was undoubted, I had had my day and should keep my mouth shut, and all would go well for me. Of course, I was not called to testify, and the case was wrapped up pretty quickly. The judge made it clear to the jury that whatever excuses I might use, the assault on Blowers that I admitted was a felony. They retired to deliberate and returned in short order with a guilty verdict, but with a recommendation for leniency. The judge gave me 3 months, which disappointed me until he pointed out that I was now a free man, having already spent that time in jail under investigation. The newspapers and local news stations picked up on this, and I kept my head down, having been warned that any inappropriate remark of mine could get me back in front of the judge. However, the insinuations were out there, and although it didn't remain a news item for long, Blower's reputation was tarnished, and his business went under within 6 months. I was satisfied with the way things turned out and decided that Tom wasn't worth the risk of killing him. I only spent 3 months in prison, but it was enough to realize that I didn't want to go back there. I forgave Robin, effectively deciding that there was nothing to forgive except that she had acted unwisely and left me alone in the world. I knew I would never forgive Blowers, but I made the decision that I wasn't going to do anything about it. The end. Couldn't be. A year passed, and I was relieved that the company accepted me back, although I never felt completely comfortable in the office again. I kept an eye on what Blowers was doing, and for the first year it wasn't much. I don't know where he got the money from, but at the end of that year, he opened another office in a town about 40 miles away. It wasn't such a big deal, and the office itself wasn't so well equipped, but I hadn't forgotten what he did, and it was too good for the likes of him. I caught him leaving the office one dark winter evening, and he might have guessed who it was, but had no real way of confirming it. The first time it might have been considered a fair fight, but this time it wasn't. I didn't drag out my punishment as I had plenty of time to get back to where I still officially was, and the iron bar I had brought with me to the party allowed me to do so. I could have killed him, but I didn't want to anymore. I could have beaten him to a pulp, but I didn't want to. I wanted him to be hurt, but not so badly that he wouldn't be able to recover months later, knowing, though unable to prove it, that it was me, and that I would be back again and again. The police came, of course, but I had a solid alibi. I had never left the ship on which I had spent the evening visiting my old friends, and you can't think of a more reliable alibi than a ship. I was no longer sure I liked the man I had become, but I was on a mission, and that's what mattered. I couldn't date, but for the first time in my life, I paid a few women to scratch an itch that needed to be addressed, but always remained unsatisfied and wanted the women gone as soon as possible. My life seemed to stop, and I had no idea how long it would last. I knew I needed to make a change in my life, and so I considered the option of going back to sea, which by then, most of the other people in my office were breathing a sigh of relief about. The other thing was that I didn't need a psychologist to tell me that I had to get rid of my obsession with making blowers pay. It was ruining my life, and I had to get over it. I hated the bastard, but that hatred was ruining my life more than his nonsense. It was easy, go back to sea and all would be well. But of course, it didn't work out that way. It happened a few days before I was due to leave for Kuwait for the 4th time this year, completely by accident. Walking down the street, I practically bumped into him. "You bastard," he growled, standing still with only 3 feet between us. "Get lost." I threw back at him, backing away as he loomed over me. "You'll pay, Fielding," he threatened, and suddenly all my good intentions vanished like magic. I had him where I wanted him, and he didn't even realize it. I had him, and I was going to make the most of it. He swung at me, and I ducked somewhat clumsily, looking around to make sure there were plenty of witnesses around us to confirm what was happening, that he was the one who had unprovokedly attacked me. He threw another poorly placed punch, and this time, I let his first graze my chin, exaggerating the effect by staggering backward. My boxing days, albeit limited, had returned to me. He lunged at me again, and another punch caught me off guard, throwing my head back. Damn, that hurt. Almost automatically, I threw a straight left punch to his face, feeling something break under my fist, and then a right to his unprotected chin as he staggered backward. I missed. I aimed too low and missed his chin by a good few inches. I missed and hit him right in the throat, feeling his Adam's apple crunch under the force of my blow. He collapsed. I moved in to knock the shit out of him, but he collapsed to the ground in front of me, clutching his throat and coughing horribly. I prepared to kick him where it hurt, but I stopped, took a deep breath, and backed away from him. He wasn't worth it. Not now, with so many witnesses around to tell what had happened. Now it was my turn. An hour later, I was sitting in the local police station, writing a statement with the names and addresses of the 5 people who had witnessed his unprovoked attack on me. He was going down. This time it was bloody blowers in the dock, and me on the witness stand. It was a lower court with a justice of the peace, not a judge, mainly because neither of us went to the hospital. I was hoping for a life sentence with hard labor chained in the dungeon of the Tower of London, but had to settle for a 3-month suspended sentence. To be honest, I wasn't really surprised. It didn't seem like a big deal, but it somehow soothed my anger. And if even the hatred didn't disappear completely, the intense need for revenge at least receded. I began to tell myself that even though he had forced my wife to kill herself, he hadn't meant for it to end this way. I even began to blame myself for the fact that I wasn't around that night when she came home, and so she had nothing to confess. The only thing I had no doubt about was that none of this was Robin's fault. Her memory was untouchable. I wasn't doing it for him. I was doing it for me. I realized that the hatred was consuming me, and that if I wanted to move on and get out of the bottomless pit I was sliding into, I had to do something about it. In desperation, I even went to a psychologist. Not to some expensive, highly trained psychoanalyst in a fancy office, but just a regular guy with a lot of life experience, a good listener, giving simple, sensible, and sometimes damn obvious advice. The main advice he gave me was that I can't just hide my grief and hatred, but must confront them. And to confront them, I had to forgive blowers. If I couldn't do that, I would remain a very unhappy person, and my life would have no meaning until I got rid of the hatred. I would not be able to go through the grieving period as necessary. He suggested, and I took note, that in order for this to work, my forgiveness must be known to blowers, and the best way to do that is to meet him face to face and forgive him. Not easy, I know, but this fellow counselor was quite persuasive, and it was probably the only way forward, however unpleasant it might be. So that's what I did, and it worked perfectly. 100%, you might say. But the thing is, it didn't quite work out the way the counselor thought it would. Took me 3 days to track him down. His second agency had failed when his license was revoked because he had a criminal record. I found him working in the office of some auto insurance specialist, filling out claim forms or something. He didn't want to meet me, of course, but I convinced him otherwise, and eventually, I managed to meet him on neutral ground in a local park. We sat down on a secluded bench, glancing nervously at each other, both wanting to get this meeting over with as soon as possible. "So what's this meeting about, Fielding?" he demanded. "I forgive you," I said, nearly choking on my words but desperate to speak up and disappear. "What?" he exclaimed in surprise. "I forgive you," I repeated, and it was even harder to say the words the second time. "I know what you did to my wife, but I forgive you." "Why?" "Because I need to do it to move on with my life," I told him, though even as I said those words, I suddenly realized that it wasn't going to be the magic solution I was looking for. It just wouldn't work. "But I made her," he smirked. "I damn near raped her that first time." "I know," I forced myself to say, grabbing the handles of the bench to keep from pouncing on him. "Damn me, Fielding," he laughed loudly. "She wasn't even a good woman." Later, much later, I convinced myself that it was all his fault and that he really had said the wrong thing at the wrong time. His words made me blush, and the original purpose of this encounter was forgotten. After that, I got a couple of cuts on my face, so he must have tried to fight back, and I vaguely remember him begging for mercy. I do remember the satisfying feeling when my fist smashed into something on his face for the second time since our conflict began, and his screams when I kicked the bastard a few times. I don't remember anything else, not even how I walked away and left him. There I remained in a sort of daze until that evening when I walked up the gangway to my ship leaving for Saudi Arabia. If I had thought about it, I would have marveled that I made it to the ship at all without being caught by the police. But I did. Not only that, I was never once questioned or even contacted about the murder of Tom Blowers. Yes, you heard right. Blowers wasn't an important man, but his murder made headlines not because of him, but because of the man who was arrested for his murder. His name was Mike Jones, and if that name sounds familiar to you, it's because he was a pretty well-known local hoodlum involved in all sorts of small and not-so-small scams and crimes in the neighborhood. What I didn't know, but what became clear, was that a certain Mrs. Jones worked for the insurance company in the same office as Blowers and that he was up to his old tricks again. And Mr. Jones didn't mind. When I first heard the news on the ship that evening that a body had been found in the park with a bullet wound to the head, I assumed that the press had just gotten it wrong again. When it became clear that this was not the case, I was shocked, to say the least. The court case became a sensation. Jones never denied shooting Blowers and was very clear about why the bastard deserved it. But the case became confused when a medical expert stated that Blowers may have already been dead when Jones shot him, to which another equally prominent medical gentleman disagreed, saying that such a claim could not be substantiated.